Hello and welcome to Everybody Hates Cleveland, the podcast. This is Mike Hattery. I will be driving the ship today while Jim is in transit. I am doing the NPR version of our preview podcast, so as monotone as possible. On the line with me, somewhere between Pennsylvania and North Carolina, is Jim Pete. How you doing, Jim?
So you're like driving the EHC train today while I'm driving home. There's a certain irony to that. And I got to tell you, you've let me down because that was not sultry. There was a little bit of waver in your voice there, Mike. You were emphasizing things. I am now sad.
The excitement was overwhelming. So this is our follow-up podcast from our first starting rotation podcast, in which we extolled the brilliance that is the front end of the Indians rotation and talked about the always enigmatic Trevor Bauer. So in part two, we get to talk about the back end, which is to me a ton more fun, and really how we think the back end is going to look not only in April but how it's going to look in August, which I think we have really different answers for.
I have a question though. I was thinking about this as we were pondering this podcast, Mike, and there's one thing that we didn't address, and it is important. And you know me, I like to throw wrenches in the equation, and I've been driving for 5 hours and have had plenty of time to think. Who's going to lead the Indians in strikeouts this year?
I'm going to put my money. I'm putting my money on Carrasco.
Carrasco. Interesting. Yep. I'm going to go out on a limb, and I'm going to say Corey Kluber is going to lead the team in strikeouts and perhaps pass his record. We shall see. But I digress. There's so much we could talk about with those top three guys, but I'll back off because we have plenty more to talk about.
All right, I'm taking the reins back. Get out of here, Jim. Reins are back in my hand right now. I want to redirect.
All right, you got it.
Okay. We're gonna talk about Cody Anderson. Okay, and
my boy.
He's your boy. So I think what we should do is kind of outline the cases for each of these guys being impactful in like 10 to 15 plus starts for the Indians this year. So what's the case for Cody Anderson?
Honestly, you have to start with the fact that he has options. And I almost want to stop there because we can talk about direction he's going, and we can talk about all of his stuff, we can talk about velocity. He's got options, which means he's starting the year in the minors to me. Now, if you want to talk tangibles, like, again, and I hate to beat this into the ground, this is a high IQ guy. This is a guy that the Indians have always liked. He's got makeup. He's got better velocity than people think. His problem is similar to Salazar in that, the fly ball rate has not always been kind to him. But really, if you look at his career, the Indians, sniffed him out from the Rays, who tried to draft him the year before the Indians. He was a reliever. I wrote a really interesting piece on him a year ago or so, talking about how little he's been a pitcher, let alone a starter. So he's kind of in his infancy as far as starting goes in his career. So I think there's a lot of unknown with Cody Anderson, and we're starting to see that sort of play out over his major league career. I think, Mike, if he can locate low in the zone and he can sort of transform the way we're seeing Salazar transform and start giving up more ground balls with this defense, I think he can become a better than bottom end starter. Now, is that this year? I don't know. I know he struggled and rebounded by going from AA to AAA to the major leagues last year, and not only went to the major leagues, but pitched well in his early stint, got hurt, came back, and when everybody thought everybody was going to figure him out, they didn't. So that says a lot to me. Now, this is year two, so a lot's going to play out, I think, come his eventual call up to the team. And I think that'll play out in May or June when someone gets injured or they need an extra starter. I think he's going to be number 6 in this long line of starters, unless the Indians need a lefty. And we'll get into that guy in a second. I love Cody Anderson. I think in the end, in my estimation, he can be a better Josh Tomlin as he starts to figure out how to pitch.
Yeah, so I think for me, like the really big deal is his youth. I won't lie, I'm a little trepidatious about Anderson. My concern is he doesn't strike out many guys, and his ground ball percentage wasn't dominant. And one of those things, he either has to start striking more guys out, or the ground ball sort of rate has to improve. And I think it might. To me, the best case is the one you made. I mean, he's young. He's a young pitcher, and young pitcher in terms of he's still really building that arsenal as he goes. He's adding pitches. He's playing with pitches, and we've seen a couple of reports this spring that he's really worked on a curveball that the Indians like, which would be a huge step for him in terms of improving that strikeout rate. So this spring has made me a little more optimistic about him, and definitely his youth as a pitcher. But I'm reticent. But you
Well, I
brought
mean,
up.
well,
Go
I
ahead.
mean, and I just think when you think about Cody Anderson and you think about, his development as a major league pitcher, he started tinkering with the curveball long before last year, but started using it. He started using it behind the scenes last year. This is something that he's been working on all off season. When they put him to work, he made that massive mistake heading into his full year of Double A after struggling for a full season. Uh, he made that mistake of not really working out in a way that a major league pitcher works out. He was doing that chopping wood crap and, again, building an arsenal from being a reliever, moving into the starting role, pitched really well in Carolina before struggling. They sent him off on a mission in the offseason last year, and he came back strong. Again, this year's mission was the curveball. Now, Mike, and we talked about this off air last night. If he comes up with the curveball as an average offering, he becomes an intensely effective starter, as judged by his ability to locate. His big knock throughout his career has been his K rate. The catch-22 with him is he does have some decent velocity. That curveball could be a game changer in a couple of ways. I mean, both ways you're talking about. Obviously, with a curveball, if it's any semblance of a good curveball, ground ball rate improves. And, I don't have to mention what a curveball can do off balance wise for a starter who's throwing 93, 94 and can touch 95, 96. It could be a game changer for him. And he's a smart pitcher. Again, mentioning the IQ, this is a guy who kind of went off base a year and a half ago, and the Indians shifted him, and he's done everything they've asked him to do. So I do agree 100% with everything you said. I think this is a guy who's going to, like Tomlin before him, could shine through.
Anderson is like, I think Anderson, I'd like to see. The really interesting thing, which kind of leads me to House's big league performance is what I want to see Anderson do. What I really want to see Anderson become. I'm not worried about him having a dominant K rate, but getting it to league average and just getting a ton of ground balls is what I'd like to see, which kind of leads me to my excessive optimism about TJ House. This is a dude who was rock solid in his, first year of MLB performance, over 100 innings. He got 59% ground balls last year and 60% in his best season. Gets tons. And we've talked about this infield defense. If you can be a guy who can be like top 5 in the league and getting ground balls in front of this infield defense, you're going to have a really good shot at being very, very productive. And House looks like that guy. You've talked a lot about sort of his progression in terms of his body progression specifically. Do you think 2014 was fool's gold in terms of the results he got, or do you think that's something we can expect from him, because that's really good production?
Well, I always tend to lean towards how front office manages a player. And when I first started covering Carolina and Kinston for IBI, he was a guy that they thought highly of. He was a young lefty, fairly decent power arm that they felt could develop. And he struggled for 3 years, and he struggled with a lot of different things. Location, he struggled with, as you mentioned, the body. He just wasn't, in shape. And then he got in shape. And then he started doing a lot of the things that they asked him to do as he matured. Do I think 2014 was a mirage? And we talked a little bit about this in some ways yesterday when we talked about the starting rotation. I don't know. I don't, he's not a top end guy. Like Anderson, he's got some velocity there as a lefty. This isn't a soft tossing lefty like we've seen in the past with some of our other left-handers in the system. He does have some velocity. Do I think he can get better? No, I don't. I think he is what he is. I think teams will figure him out a bit. Do I think he can be effective locating low in the zone, inducing a lot of ground balls with a fairly decent K rate? Yeah, I mean, and as a left-hander. I mean, that's the big thing. The Indians aren't really ripe with a lot of lefties. And while a lot of people poo-poo that, there are certain rosters in the Central in particular and in baseball that can be really affected by a lefty starter here and there. So he's going to find a spot simply because he's a lefty. And don't forget, like I mentioned before, this front office loves him. They love him. And they always have handled him as a guy who they thought could be decent. So we'll see, Mike. I mean, the big thing for House this year will be opportunity. He's not probably, and again, he's got options left. He's not probably going to be a guy that starts the year off with the team, but is like in 2014, will be given opportunities as the year progresses. What he does with those opportunities will be interesting to watch. I wouldn't bet against him. And I think as we go through all these guys, like Cody Anderson, I mean, these are guys I just don't feel like you can bet against because they've been put through the ringer in one way or another and have come through the other side. They believe in themselves. They have a high baseball IQ. And, like I said, they figure things out a lot faster than other teams figure them out.
House to me is really interesting. The one thing that I think could make him something really special is if he can sort of sustain the walk rate that he posted in 2014. My tendency is to believe that's kind of fool's gold, that he's probably more of a, like low threes walk rate than he is like a 1.9 walk rate, which is truly elite. I think if you look at like, and this is hyperbole, I'm not comping him to Dallas Keuchel, but Dallas Keuchel is a guy who gets 60% ground balls. He gets a roughly 2 walks per 9, and then he strikes out, 7 to 8 per 9. And that's what we saw from TJ House in a 120 inning sample or 102 inning sample. We saw those same peripherals. I don't think he's that good. I don't think the walk rate is that good, but I think, we have a guy who is really rock solid. The ground balls are just such an asset, especially with Lindor and that left side of the infield. So I think, to me, House has so much upside in terms of just being really rock solid. And to me, he could be a really good 4 starter on a contender. And I like him maybe the most of anyone other than Clevenger, maybe, in terms of upside in this system. Well, not in the system, in the picture for the nation.
Right. And I think, and this is what's interesting about today's conversation that makes this Indians team vastly different from the teams heading into 2016 is I think, with Anderson, this is a guy who has, in my opinion, untapped potential and has youth on his side. And again, is a young pitcher in that, he hasn't pitched a lot in his life, let alone his career as a big league pitcher. You look at a guy like TJ House, I think in a similar fashion, this is a guy who, there's a lot to him that we don't know yet. If he factors somewhere in the middle, Mike, of where he was in 2014 and where I think people think he is, we end up with a really quality starter and a guy who, again, kind of can sweep into that 4 or 5 spot and be fine with. So those are those 2 guys right there. And we already talked about Trevor Bauer in the last podcast, who has more talent, I think, than all of these guys. We're just trying to figure that head out. So, the funny thing is, as the season progresses, we still haven't gotten to the guy that I was alluding to, who may have more talent than all these guys.
I think you struck on something really important, though, in terms of depth. One of the things that makes me think the Indians really upgraded over last year, even though it's kind of hard to see on the surface, and I'll talk rotation first, is that last year we gave 5 starts to Toru Murata, Bruce Chen, and Sean Markham, a little over 5 starts, actually. And the worst quality of pitcher we're going to see getting a start this year for the Indians is so much better than any of those guys, which is a definite improvement to me in the roster in terms of how much the depth has improved for this team. And I think you see that on the offense too, where Swisher, Bourne, Avilos, and Moss got over 1,000 at bats, and I think everyone who's getting those at bats over them last year is going to be better. So it's something where on the surface a star isn't brought in, but the sort of depth of the team has improved to the point that those at bats and those starts have really improved in terms of the quality of player getting them.
Oh, I agree 100%. I mean, and I know this is completely off topic, but as I worry about this outfield, you think about Bourne and Swisher and all these other guys. How much worse can it get? It can't get much worse than those two. So, but I digress.
No, it really can't. The other thing, all right, I'm going to do a 20-second drop here for Jose Ramirez because we haven't talked to him about him in like a week, and it's just been like way too long for me. So Jose Ramirez, Mike Avila's got over 350 plate appearances last year, and he was a -1 WAR player. Okay, so Jose Ramirez is going to, like, the super utility guy is like a starting player in baseball that you have to think about now because they all get 350 to 400 plate appearances. So, like, having an upgrade at the position is huge. Okay, moving back. You talked about upside. You talked about the guy we want to talk about. Mike Clevenger, I'm assuming that's where you're going. Am I right?
Yeah, I mean, he's a guy, and I hate to say it, kind of snuck up on me, and I'll be the first one to admit it. As I look back in hindsight, which people on the internet rarely do, you watch how they handle a guy. And, if you watched the Indians over the past several years, how they handled starting with Danny Salazar, moving on to a guy like Corey Kluber, moving on to a guy like, I'm going to leave Carlos Carrasco out of this because he's not in the same boat as a lot of these other guys. Moving on to a guy like Cody Anderson, and now kind of looking at this current roster, that they've handled Clevenger in a way that screams to me that they think he's going to be a top-end guy. He comes into spring training with some really interesting intangibles, some good velocity, quirky character, but a guy who they love the makeup of. Again, he kind of fits in the same boat as all of these other guys. I'm not going to say the two letters that I'm thinking of, Mike. You can digress from there. This is a guy who I think they're looking at as a 1 through 5 guy in this rotation in the near future. Whereas I think some of these other guys, they're not sure about. And when I say that, I say not sure about as a top 5 guy long term, which is interesting because you could make a case about any of the guys we're going to talk about. But to me, Mike, and I'll throw this back to you, I think of all the players, and while this might not be the year, of all the players that we've talked about from 4 on, Mike Clevenger may end up being the guy who is 4. Maybe not this year, but he's certainly in that equation next year. And depending on health of pitcher, could be sooner.
Absolutely. So Clevenger is really interesting to me. We talk a lot about sort of like how they're handled in the system. And one of the ways you see priority is when guys are sort of bounced around for playoff reps. You've talked about it a lot with Kipnis and a couple other guys where you'll see them sort of in AA the whole year and they'll bounce for like one the postseason in Columbus if Akron isn't in the postseason. And
yeah.
Clevenger got bounced up there last year and was absolutely dominant in that start. And I think that kind of shows the priority he gets. Clevenger is really just completely compelling to me. I think I agree. He is the highest upside of these dudes. I also want to say one thing about this conversation that's really cool. If you ask the White Sox or the Tigers, Cody Anderson or TJ House are clearly in their starting rotations to start the year. And these are two guys who are probably going to be in AAA for the Indians to start the year. And these are teams we're contending with. So if you want really a nice hook for why to be optimistic, that's a really good one, especially those other teams which have really top-heavy rotations and don't have any depth like the Indians, and old rotations comparatively. So that's huge to me. They don't even have major league depth, let alone AAA depth as good as the Indians in terms of the rotation. But Clevenger is, that K rate spike is awesome. They've shown him the priority of AAA. How many do you think he gets more than 5 starts in 2015, or do you think this is a guy who maybe subs in and out, but he's not, he's given more time in AAA?
My only hesitancy with him is he's got the most options of the bunch. So he could be a guy that you see making spot starts here and there. I don't think he touches the Indians until either extreme need, and I think the fact that we've covered, I guess, Clevenger. We haven't really talked about Tomlin yet, but we've covered, 7 guys, possibly 8, possibly even 9 if you really get down to it. I think the fact that we've talked about so many people, it would take to me an extreme amount of distress to see him before even August. I think it gets really interesting come end of July, come early August, and one of 2 ways for Clevenger. If he pitches well in Columbus, and there's no reason to think that he doesn't, but if he continues along the path that you mentioned, he's clearly a guy that they're going to bring up. I hate talking bullpen. I don't think they're going to bring him up for the bullpen because I think that's not the way they handle starters that they see as, I'm not going to use the term elite, but they see as starters, top 5 guys. However, the Indians are really interesting when it comes to playoff pushes, and the front office doesn't make trades to make splashes often, like the Ubaldo Jimenez deal a few years ago. They like to bring guys up, and if you're going to bring a guy up who can make a splash, if Clevenger continues on the trajectory, this is a guy with velocity. This is a guy who can hit corners. This is an interesting guy. I mean, this is a guy who you can bring up in August with a fresh arm, who people don't know much about, who could make a difference in this rotation, especially if there's somebody struggling or somebody who's got a tired arm or someone, heaven forbid, who's injured. The other thing that we have to keep in mind here is if you look big picture with the Indians, prospects, there are some other interesting starters who won't be ready this year. Whoever the Indians may look at a little bit, believe it or not, higher than Clevenger, and we could get into the several guys that could fit into that realm. And the reason why I mention that is the Indians didn't make a major move this offseason, which leads me to believe if they are contending come July, they'll be looking to make moves late June, early July, before the end of that deadline. Clevenger could be that enticing piece for a team looking for young starting pitchers ready to start. He's going to be ready to start in July. Period. End of story. I don't care what other people say, including the organization. This could be a guy that they're serving up possibly as trade bait in a bigger deal to maybe bring in an outfielder or bring in a corner infielder that could help this team down the stretch. So Clevenger to me is the most interesting piece. High upside guy who could be effective in this rotation for years to come, could be effective in this rotation this year, and could provide the Indians with something that they need down the stretch run.
Yeah, I think for a moment I'm going to be Joe McCarthy and read a list of names, but I think we have Sheffield, we have Aiken, we have Kaminsky, we have Hillman, we have McKenzie, who are this sort of five-some of like a lead upside sort of, except for maybe Kaminsky, but really high upside guys between rookie league and A+ ball right now, which kind of makes Clevenger interesting. I think one of the interesting things about Clevenger is that in the near term, he has the highest upside. So does that mean, a guy like Kaminsky is more tradable than a guy like Clevenger who provides you upside, who's nearby, versus somebody who's far away? But I think, I would be really surprised if the Indians are sort of in the pole position or right near the pole position come July if one of these sort of high-end pitching prospects isn't dealt, just because of the position their big league roster is in and just because of the position their depth is in. So we haven't talked about Tomlin yet, right?
Yeah, your boy, man, Josh Tom, the Cowboy.
The Cowboy. So,
yeehaw! And I'm in West Virginia. I don't know how that connects, but I'm sure it does.
Be careful. There's some dangerous people there. But I'll move on.
Well, dude, you cannot offend our millions and millions of listeners in the Mountaineer State. So to all of our fans, notice where I went there, in West Virginia, I do apologize for those comments, no matter how true they are. Okay, go ahead. Josh Tomlin's not from – Swisher's from West Virginia. He's not with the team anymore. Tomlin's not from West Virginia, is he?
He's from Texas. We're good.
Yeah, I know.
So a while ago, A while ago, I wrote this piece about Josh Tomlin that kind of talked about why he's made the leap the last 2 years. And I kind of noticed a couple of things that seemed to me to be really positive indicators, and I think kind of why the Indians might have signed him to this extension, even though it might just be because it was a stupid favorable extension and should fire his agent probably, but that's another issue. Uh, but he obviously doesn't walk anybody, but one of the things that's been a huge deal is he's sort of wielded his curveball in a way that he hadn't before. It's an elite pitch, and he's throwing it a lot more below the zone than leaving it in the zone. His control and command of the pitch around the zone and below the zone has become exceptional. So when you don't walk anybody and you strike out 7 per 9, that's a really good start. Obviously, he gives up a couple too many home runs, and that can be frustrating at times. But the Arsenal's kind of leapt forward, and I think he's a guy who has a sneaky arsenal because I don't think we talk about command and control enough. When we talk about pitchers, we just worry about velocity and how filthy this pitch is and how filthy that pitch is. And I think you kind of see with him a guy who the velocity doesn't grade well, but the arsenal as a whole grades well because the command and control is so good. So, Tomlin really excites me. The biggest worry for me is we talked about arm health a little and how we weren't necessarily concerned with the front end. To me, the thing with Tomlin is always going to be arm health at this point. Can he stay on the mound?
Yeah, so here, you mentioned command and control, and I'm going to just back up here a second, and we talk about how teams handle certain pitchers. And Tomlin's an interesting guy here because as you watch him throughout his career, the Indians, while they don't talk much about Tomlin, they have had every reason over the years not to have Josh Tomlin on the team, from injury to struggle. This is a guy that they keep giving chances to, and this is a guy who keeps taking opportunity, lassos opportunity. I apologize for the bad pun, but he seems to, I know it is what it is. But here's the thing, to keep in mind with Tomlin, he doesn't have plus velocity, but he can locate. As you mentioned, the key for me this year, and here's the interesting thing with Tomlin. There isn't a major league player in National League or the American League that's afraid of Josh Tomlin. They swing. They want to knock the ball out of the park. This is the key for me this year will be if they watch tape and they don't offer on those lower pitches, because I think a lot of those pitches they bite on because they think they can knock them out of the park, to be quite honest with you, to just get to the grassroots of the whole thing. So it'll be very interesting to see how he responds to that, because I think you're going to see a lot of guys walk up there with the intent on keeping their bat on the shoulder until they see something come floating over the center of the plate. If he doesn't bite, if he can figure out a way around that, I think you're going to see, again, a guy who keeps overcoming. Now, he's got limitations. A lot of people are worried about someone was talking about a statistic about how he's like number 2 on the list of most likely to have Tommy John again. I don't know how you come up with that, but I will see. He, to me, is the greatest insurance policy you could possibly have. He's, got a nice contract for 2 years for the Indians. This is a guy you just throw out in the rotation and you just pitch until his arm falls off. And this is no offense to Josh Tomlin, because I'm sure he's okay with that. But, he's your number 5 guy or number 4 guy, however you want to put him, until they need somebody else. And he'll probably be pretty good at it. And if he's not, they've got other Josh Tomlins or better. So I've had my issues with Josh Tomlin over the years. Really, I don't know. He's kind of, he's a guy you just overlook because he doesn't have that cannon. And you know what? In a rotation of cannons, sometimes you need a pop gun, and he's our pop gun. It's just like the effectiveness of a lefty in the midst of a bunch of righties. If you use them in the right way, just that alone can shock a lineup. This is a guy who comes in very different from all these other arms. I like it. I like him in the rotation for that reason.
Yeah, Tomlin's arm health is always going to be, questionable. And I think, I won't feel bad for a guy who's going to get paid $7 or $8 million to pitch his arm off ultimately. But yeah, I think obviously he's highly flawed, but he's manageably competent. He has a certain skill set that's okay. And for a 5th starter, he's really solid. I don't expect him to make more than 15, 20 starts this year, be it health, be it House, Anderson, or Clevenger forcing their way
Well,
in. I
and
mean, they
Mike, let's
all
be
have
honest. I
higher
mean,
ceilings.
do you see another guy that we've talked about better suited to the bullpen than Tomlin? I mean, he seems to be a guy to me. I mean, he was in the pen before. This is a guy to me, of all the guys we mentioned, who the Indians will be more apt to slide into the bullpen for a couple of starts for somebody else and then slide back into the rotation, then say a Cody Anderson or for sure a Clevenger. Uh, in my opinion, even a guy like TJ House, who I don't see as a pen guy at all. So do you see Tomlin perhaps getting hidden a little bit in the bullpen throughout the year to get other guys starts?
Yeah, I think that's the great thing.
Especially House.
That's the great thing about Tomlin, I think. I think he's someone who's very comfortable in that role. He's done it before, sort of flipping between. He's someone who's been successful in both roles. He's very cheap, so it's not, a sunk, a lost cost moving him to the pen. I think it's perfect in terms of making that fifth rotation spot flexible when you have that much depth. So that makes sense to me. I just love their back end. I think Tomlin's really solid. I think he's good in terms of oscillating. If House and Anderson force their way in and look outstanding, that's great for the Indians. That's a great problem to have, and I think one of them probably will. One of those three, probably House, Anderson, Clevenger. I think one of them's going to look really good and force their way in, which is going to be outstanding. So I don't think you can have a better situation. I guess we can talk about a couple more fringy dudes. Sean Moramondo. I mean, I guess we can talk about him.
Yeah, okay. So one of the last guys that I covered up close and personal in Carolina, a guy that I've talked to more than one occasion. The last year that I covered him, he got into shape in the similar fashion as TJ House. Not to the same extent. Not a big guy, not a guy that's going to overpower you. But I will say this. If you watch the way that they've handled Moramondo, he's a guy that they've handled in a very interesting way. I think they look at him as a potential major league starter. It's interesting that he's going to see a bit of time here in spring training. And it'll be interesting to watch this year, velocity-wise. He's never, again, you got to look at K rate with him. We've seen a little bit of a spike with him over the past year. This is a guy who's improved from year to year to year, so you got to like that. I don't see him as a high upside guy, but again, you always got to take a left-hander seriously. There's a lot of other things I could say about him. I'm just going to back off on right now. I have my doubts about Moramondo, and I'll just leave it at that. He's a pensive guy. And again, I might be overstating that in makeup wise, but I upside, I don't see a lot there. Could he be a fill-in guy this year? I don't see it. Next year, he could be part of the equation. There are so many arms that are going to fly past him. He reminds me a little bit of a Ronnie Rodriguez, a guy that, your boy. He reminds me of a guy that the organization kind of likes and likes as kind of a glue kind of way that can kind of glue up the minor leagues and maybe get a taste in the minors or in the majors as a specific sort of maybe long reliever or spot starter and then bounce back and forth a little bit. I just see all these other guys flying past him in the next year or so. So to me, Moramondo, if he's going to do anything, he better do it quick. And he better make a name for himself quick because there's some elite arms coming up that are going to just make him look kind of simple. I mean, what do you think? I mean, I know we're beatniks, minor league beatniks, but is Moramondo a guy? I mean, I just don't see him. He's not better than TJ House to me. So why other than youth? He's younger than TJ House. Not much younger, but younger than TJ House. I mean, do you see anything there this year, Mike, or is this a guy who we hope for next year or gets blown past?
Yeah, I just don't see. I think if Sean Moramondo is pitching in the Indians rotation, like more than 30 starts in the next 3 years, something went horribly, horribly wrong. which
or he does something incredible, which, I mean, they've handled him that way. You can't look at the way they've handled him and not think, well, maybe they see something that we don't. But there are lots of guys they've done that with, and I've gone, oh yeah, I'm going to like this guy. And this is no offense to Armando. He's done everything he's needed to do. I just don't see the upside.
yeah, I don't see it either. He's someone who to me is like a lesser Anderson in house. He doesn't get the ground balls that they get. He doesn't even, he might get around Anderson's ground balls, and he doesn't really strike a lot of guys out, and he walks a lot of dudes. Those are the three things I'm looking for, and he doesn't do any of them well enough at the minor league level to think, that he's going to do any of them well enough at the big league level. So I'm not positive. Any Ryan Merritt thoughts? You want to talk about Ryan Merritt a little bit?
His name keeps popping up, and I mean, I could give you a whole bevy of Indian starters from the past who have caught our attention in the minor leagues and then sort of drifted off. There's some interesting intangibles there. He's had some high K games, but again, I think he's a guy that we may see as a spot start in a 31-day stretch of games without a day off and some doubleheaders thrown in. Like I said, he's a guy I think gets passed over because he turns out to be a really good minor league hand. I'd love to be a minor league hand. There's nothing wrong with that, but with the Indians and the type of pitching that we're going to see over the next couple of years and beyond, I just don't see it.
Yeah, there's really nothing there beyond the walk rate to really make you think anything particularly special is going to happen. Geez, I mean, we've talked about how deep they are. I guess when you're talking about like I guess we're talking about the 11th and 12th dudes on the depth chart probably. That's pretty positive. So we're gonna get to prediction time here.
This is a tricky one, Mike. I'm glad you're running this because there's so many different predictions we could make with this. I suspect you're going to make us do them all, but this is an interesting topic because there's so many different ways we can go with this.
All right, so I'm going to go back 4-5 here, the 4 and 5. What I want to do is I'm going to just say over under, and I'm going to give you a number of starts.
Okay.
And I think an efficient way to do this. So let's just lay out Bauer. I'll set the over under at 20 starts. Do you think he gets more or less in 2016?
So there's the optimist Jim and there's the pessimist Jim. And if you would have asked me how many starts he gets this year, I probably would have said 20. I'm going to say over.
Okay, I'll take the over too. I'll set Tomlin at 15. Do you think over or under?
Under.
Very good.
I'm gonna say under, and I probably should just keep my mouth shut, but I'm gonna say at least 5 games under that.
Wow. So I see him in the 10 to 15 range, like a slight under, but that's, I definitely don't see him making 30 starts this year either way. 20 would be crazy to me, honestly.
I hope he proves us wrong. I swear to you, I hope he makes 30 starts. If he makes 30 starts for the Indians, we're winning a whole buttload of games, or we have a whole buttload of bat arms.
Yeah, I mean, to me, the biggest thing with Tomlin is, he's never pitched over 160 innings, so I think that's a pretty big barrier for him. I love him. I think he's, I'm really positive about him being, competent when he's pitching. I'm just not sure he's going to be able to stay out there. Okay, so we have a lot of starts kind of floating around then. So we have 30 or 40 starts kind of floating in the perimeter here. So let's take a look at Cody Anderson first. He looks like the next man up. Cody Anderson over under 10 starts.
Over. Way over.
All right. I'm gonna take the under actually. I think he's gonna underperform a little bit. I think they're gonna, if House is healthy, I think he'll end up collecting a lot of starts. So I'm gonna move to House now, and I'll set the over under at 10 again.
I will say under.
I'm gonna say over clearly. And the last
So
one,
there's really our balance counterbalance. I think we agree on this rotation. I think I see Anderson as the guy who's going to take the bulk of the starts away from some of these other guys, and you see House as that guy with the unknown commodity coming up.
yeah, the last one, obviously, Clevenger, I think we both said, we're very optimistic about him. Long term, we don't see him up till August. So I'll put it at, 5 starts. Do you think he gets more than 5 starts in 2016?
I'm going to say just over 5.
Gosh, I hate how much we agree, Jim. It really is bad. We need to first take this action a little bit more because I'm going to take just over 5 as well. I think he gets probably 5 to 8 starts this year.
I think he's a September call-up no matter what. In some form or fashion, unless something goes wrong, if he gets hurt or if he struggles, which is always a possibility. But, he's the wild card in all this for me because, if he's dominating in Columbus, you made the call with him. They brought him up to Columbus at the tail end of last year, and that's a sure sign that they like him. Do they think he needs a full season in Columbus is the big question. And I just don't think they do. I think they love his makeup. He's the wild card in all this. But you know how they handle options. So I don't know, man. If he earns it, do they give it to him? That's the question. I don't know.
I think he has the highest potential to make you and I look foolish, partially because, one thing I always pay attention to with the Indians is, and really anyone, is age. And Clevenger's a dude who he's had some injuries that's sort of slowed his progress, but he's 25 years old now. He pitched a full season, really dominant in Double-A. He got a little taste of Triple-A, and I think you and I, more than anyone, really think of Triple-A as often a finishing school, and sometimes just a way station, more than a finishing school. And to me, I think he's someone who I think you pointed out. If he pitches well for 2 months, I think he could be up in June. But I think it's probably more likely that they give the sort of opportunity to Anderson and House first because they've shown something at the big league level, and I think the Indians sometimes prioritize that.
Yeah, I at the end of the day, this is all a dance, especially for a guy like Francona, who we know handles pitchers of all shapes and sizes in very strange ways sometimes. I think that at the end of the day, the nice thing about it, and you've talked about this, Adam's talked about this, I think the options that are given to Terry Francona ultimately will make or break this team because sometimes these options he doesn't play very well. And, when we talked about the team last year and who they were throwing out there, it's almost like he can just close his eyes, reach in the bag, and pull a guy out. So at the end of the day, for me, Mike, I don't care how this shakes out. I don't care if you're right with House and he makes 20 starts, 25 starts this year. I'm not worried about that. If it's Anderson, I'm not worried about that. If it's Tomlin, I'm not worried about that. Honestly, the only thing I worry about is the top 3 guys and whether or not they can stay healthy or not. If those 3 guys stay healthy, we have darts that will hit the bullseye enough times outside of those top 3 that we have a really good starting rotation that makes a lot of really good offensive teams look really average. And if we can do that, it's going to be a fun year, regardless of what the offense does.
Yeah, absolutely. I also think that if there's any, you want the front end to stay intact, but Clevenger's, sort of ascendance is going to be really interesting. And really any of these guys, I think the really exciting thing to me is the Indians can have Kluber, Salazar, Carrasco, one of those guys miss 5 to 7 starts and cover it and be competent in those outings, and the teams they're competing against can't. And that's a huge deal because I think you're going to have one of those guys miss 5 to 10 starts. Pitching gets, there are issues, as long as you don't lose one in April. But the great thing is they're going to be able to cover one of those guys being out 5 to 7 starts, and they're going to have competent starting pitching in those roles. Whereas the rest of the division, if they lose a guy, they're going to have, Toru Murata types filling in. And that's a huge advantage for the Indians.
And you kind of touched on something there, Mike, because I think a lot of, Clevenger's appearance with the big league club could depend on those top 3 guys because to me, they're not bouncing Clevenger around. They're not going to bounce into the pen, bounce into the rotation. They're not going to bring him up for a spot start here or there. They're going to handle him like Salazar. So the way you're going to see Clevenger stick is if they know one of the top three's out for 5 to 7 starts. They're not going to bring up a 4 or 5 guy to replace that spot in the rotation. That's where Clevenger, say you're in August and say you're missing a Justin Masterson back when Justin Masterson was one of our top 2 guys. You're not going to replace a Justin Masterson with, TJ House. And this is no offense with TJ House. You're going to replace him with Danny Salazar, or in this case, Mike Clevenger. So I think who goes out, if anyone, is going to be the big story as the year progresses. And the interesting thing about it is that we have all guys of all different shapes and sizes to fill those roles. So, it's going to be a fun year. And I think, it's really going to shake out in years to come. This is a big year for this rotation because we're going to see some guys step up and the competition is going to be phenomenal. When you have high IQ guys who are as competitive as some of these guys are, and if you want to talk about TJ House, Cody Anderson, Josh Tomlin, you want to talk about intangibles, watch how competitive they are. And I've got to see it up close, and you to a certain extent as well, Mike. That's where it gets fun. We've talked about domino effect over the years, about how Kluber has dominoed into Carrasco, who's dominoed into Salazar. And Ubaldo was in that equation as well for a while, Masterson. It's going to be fun watching these guys domino into each other and watch them try to outperform each other. I think that's where you're going to see substantial growth in this team. You're going to see the cream rise to the crop, and I hate using cliches like that, but this really is that type of rotation. I'd love to see a guy try to get into that top 3 outside. I'd love to see Bauer take the challenge and try to be better than Salazar, where he thought he would be 2 years ago. This is where the rotation gets fun, because I think there's enough upside with some of these 4 or 5 guys where you could see Salazar struggle for a little bit or see Carrasco struggle for a little bit and go, hey, wait a second, Anderson's pitching better than he is. House is pitching better than he is. And that's where it gets really fun, because then our rotation becomes wipeout rotation, which would be really, for me, the difference between an 85-win team and a 93-win team, to be perfectly honest.
Yeah. It's awesome when you're in a sort of circumstance where you have 5 legit dudes and you're saying, I need 2 of you to make the leap, or 1 of you to make the leap, and the rest of you can make the 5 hole competent. And I think there's sort of, you look at each of these pitchers and they have warts, but they also have sort of arsenals, except for Tomlin. I think Tomlin, we've sort of seen the ceiling. But I think Anderson, be it adding the curveball, House, be it the stabilizing the walk rate and retaining the ground ball rate, or Bauer throwing more strikes, or Clevenger just getting more innings under his belt. I mean, you have 4 dudes who you can really say this guy can leap into being an above average big league starter, and that's your fourth best pitcher, and that is just outstanding to have, and really why they're going to be competitive this year and for the next couple of years.
Hey, Mike, by the way, I mean, I hate to say this word. We talk a lot about the control we have with the big 3. Look at the control we have with these guys. There's going to be a day where we have the podcast where we're talking about Sheffield with these guys, or we're talking about Aiken with these guys. These are guys they have under control into the 2020s, with the exception of Tomlin. I mean, it's as a fan of baseball, as a fan of the Cleveland Indians, I mean, this is tasty stuff.
Yeah, I don't think you can be sort of in a better long-term pitching position than the Indians are in. I know the Mets have a lot of young pitching that they have locked down, but this sort of elite rotation, the depth they have, and then all this upside they have stacked in the lower minors, you're kind of looking at this open decade of just really good pitching. And obviously pitching prospects burn out like crazy and major league starters burn out like crazy, but just sit here, we can appreciate where we are. And the advantage we have, and it's outstanding. I also think that it means that somebody we really like is going to get traded in the next 2 years.
Well, and it may not be the guy we think. The options are endless, and I hate talking trades, especially with guys that I love. But there's some really, really interesting guys on this team currently and in the future who a lot of other organizations covet. real quick, Mike, and I know we got to wrap things up soon, but real quick, does Danny Salazar sign long-term this year? Is he a guy that we sign in March?
I don't know why we wouldn't sign him in March. I think the only reason would be if he didn't want to, sort of remain long-term. So I absolutely think so. He and Lindor are my priorities. I think if your offseason is sort of what they've done so far, which I know is underwhelming, plus locking those two dudes up to long-term extensions, I'll be very, very happy. I love this core. I'm ready to ride with it.
Hey, look, I predicted Danny Salazar would win 2 Cy Youngs in his career. Maybe it'll start this year. Why not just start throwing some hot takes out? Maybe it'll be that, you know what? Cody Anderson for president. I mean, seriously. Honestly, we know nothing about his politics, but he couldn't get much worse than I digress. I'm not talking politics. I'm just kidding. For those of you that turned off, turn it back on.
We promise we're done with politics. But no, we should wrap this up. Check out all of our past position preview podcasts. There's a lot of alliteration that I just dropped on y'all right there, so be thankful for that. But seriously, we've gone really in depth on every single position for the Indians. We're really proud of these. We're hopefully going to go back and sort of review the positions as spring training comes to a close with a lot of people who are more insightful than I am. So stay tuned for that. Anything you got coming out in the next couple of days, Jim?
Well, a couple of things just to kind of keep your eyes out for. Again, make sure you check out these positional podcasts. You and I will have a little bit more free time this week, so I think the 2 areas I'd like to go next to be on the lookout for this week: lineups. As we look at this lineup offensively going into 2016 season, I think that's the biggest question mark. Mike and I are going to take a look at the lineup, the potential lineups that Francona can put out there, and we'll see how absolutely wrong we are and how frustrated we are as the year progresses. So we'll look there. I also think it's important to take a look at on-the-field management from, Terry Francona, who we are very honest about at EHC, why Sandy Alomar is not a manager at this point, and some of these other guys that Terry Francona has who are really high on, Mickey Callaway, of course. I want to make sure we go there and talk about this really interesting relationship between Chris Antonetti and Mike Chernoff. Chernoff is maybe my favorite guy in the front office for a variety of reasons, and I know, Mike, in the depths of your mind, you know why, but Chernoff seems to me, I talk about bridges. He seems to be a guy who is building bridges in this organization in ways that I really, really enjoy. So we'll be going down that road. I do have a piece coming out this week, a corner coming up probably Tuesday or Wednesday, detailing the manageable pieces that the Indians have and how this puzzle fits way better than the puzzle from last year. And we touched upon it almost in every podcast leading up to this. So take a look in Tuesday and Wednesday. And then Mike and I or someone will follow up with a podcast talking about that puzzle. Mainly, look at our podcasts. We are going to podcast more than anyone else. Not only are we going to be here, but check out Mike on TTN from a few days ago with Jake Dungan from IBI at Scout, and Tristan Tito, Caitlin Boron from Burning River Baseball. Very good stuff there. We have the roundtable that I was a part of a couple days before that, and we got a ton of stuff coming out here at EHC at Tribe Time Now. So we got a lot of stuff. Just come and take a look. We got all kinds of stuff coming out, Mike. It's like a potpourri of wonder. Maybe that should be the new name of our site. EHC's Potpourri of Wonder.
Yeah, so seriously, check out the podcast. We're going to be on here all the time, as we've shown really over the last month. We pumped out a ton. And I've listened to Cleveland radio. I do it in the car when I drive to law school in the morning. It sucks so hard. I'm not a genius, but I think we're doing something really fun here. So check in often. We'll have a couple a week with different voices than just our own. And I think they're going to be a lot of fun. So, all right, for Mike Hattery and Jim Pete, CHC, signing off.